Today on Super Soul Sunday, columnist, pundit, and best-selling author David Brooks.
I got disconnected, and around the country, millions of people are disconnected, and there are people alone, people not being helped, people do distrust each other.
David Brooks writes a popular column for the New York Times and voices his political opinions on shows like PBS NewsHour and NBC's Meet the Press.
We do what any mayor and governor would do. There's a problem here, let's fix the problem.
In 2015, I interviewed David about his best-selling book, The Road to Character.
We sin when we have our loves out of order. We know that our love of family is higher than our love of money, or our love of truth should be higher than our love of money. And if we're lying to get money, we're putting our loves out of order.
In his new book, The Second Mountain, The Quest for a Moral Life, David says there are two metaphorical mountains we climb in our lifetimes.
So the first mountain is what a lot of us do. We get out of school, and we think, I'm going to climb this mountain. I'm going to be a cop, a teacher, a journalist, an actor, and that's the mountain I'm going to climb. Second mountain is the ultimate allegiance not to self.
David believes we all have to find a collective path to greater connection, meaning, and lasting joy.
You sort of focus, well, what does my heart want? My heart wants to fuse with another. And what does the soul want? My soul wants to serve some good.
Plus, a side he rarely shares, David's own surprisingly personal, redemptive, spiritual journey. It feels like you had your own kind of transformation. What happened? This is my beloved Maya's, this is what she left me in her will, all of her books from her personal library. We call this the Maya room. And these were all in her bedroom, this whole room where were all the books from her bedroom. So I love being in this room, the Maya room. Recently, there was yet another synagogue shooting, and this was in California, and Rabbi Goldstein said something that was so moving. He said, I had to look the murderer in the face in order to be able to impart something to the rest of the world. And it's time for a change because we have lost our soul.
Wow.
And as I was preparing and reading your book, I thought you were basically saying the same thing.
Yeah,
it's time for a change. We have lost our soul.
Right.
That's really what The Second Mountain is all about, is about finding your soul.
You know, all these shootings we've had are about a lot of things, but they're almost always about one lonely person in a room.
Yes.
Who gets himself radicalized, who wants to leap from insignificance to somehow infamy by doing some horrible thing. But then the mention of that word soul, that's become a powerful word for me. I mean, Super Soul Sunday.
Yes.
Because it's so important to have that concept that each individual has a soul. And in the book I say, I'm not going to try to persuade you that God exists or not. That's not my job. But I do ask you to believe that you have some piece of you that has no size, weight, color, or shape, but is of infinite dignity and value. And rich people don't have more of this, and poor people, old, don't have more of it than young, but that our soul is, slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of a soul, that rape isn't just an attack on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an attempt to insult a soul. And the level we're all equal at is, we're not equal in our brains and in our muscles, but we're all equal in the soul. And if you don't have that concept of a soul, you're really dehumanized, I think.
And actually, every crime is a crime against the soul.
Right.
It's not just an act of violence or an act of, you know, it's a crime against the soul.
Yeah, they're not seeing your soul, and decency is about seeing deeply into the roots of other people.
I really appreciate, more than just, you know, like this book, I really appreciate that you've taken the time to assess where we are in our culture and come up with the conclusions that you have. And I would say that reading it, I went, whoa, from the beginning, what has happened to David Brooks? It feels like you had your own kind of transformation, and you write in the introduction that the wages of sin are sin. My faults accumulated and then crashed down upon me in 2013, which is about the time I interviewed you the last time. And you go on to say, I was unplanted, lonely, humiliated, scattered. What happened?
Yeah, I had fallen for the lies that our culture tells us. One of them is that that career success will lead to fulfillment. And career success has not done that for me. I don't know if it does it for others, but it has not done that for me. It's just made me ambitions that are always leaping ahead. I got to do something else.
Yeah.
And then even though I communicate for a living, I was a really bad communicator. What was in my heart was not coming out of my mouth. And I was not really focusing or spending time on my friends. I'd come to value time over people. So I always wanted to be productive, so I was always on the move. And so there I was in the winter and fall of 2013, and I was, my marriage had ended, my kids had left for college and were about to. And I was in an apartment alone, and I had weekday friends, people I could go to lunch with and talk about work, but I didn't have any weekend friends, which are the real kind of friends.
Interesting.
And so, and I never had anybody over. And
Interesting question for people. Do you have weekday friends or weekend friends?
Yeah, and I had one but not the other.
Yeah.
And I didn't have people over, and so if you went into my kitchen drawers where there should have been silverware, I just had Post-it notes. And when there should have been plates, I just had like stationery, because my life was all work, and workaholism is a way to avoid an emotional and spiritual problem. And so that was a period where, you know, it manifested itself sort of as a pain in the stomach. Loneliness is a pain in the stomach.
So you realized that you had ignored the calling of your own soul, actually.
Yeah, right.
So publishers have often said that writers write the books that they need to read. Was this the case for you, for Second Mountain?
For sure. Like,
yeah.
I like a phrase that we writers are beggars who tell other beggars where we found bread.
Oh,
like
that's a good
we
one.
found it here, I'm going to share it with you. So I wanted to write my way to a better life. And so what I did was I did a lot of reading and interviewing and thinking, how do people pull themselves out of valleys? And then for 5 years I did that, and I share it here.
Yeah, and what is true is it's unavoidable that the human experience is about navigating the valleys.
Yeah. I had a college student come up to me, and I was talking about suffering and what it can teach, and she said, I haven't really suffered that much. Should I go find some? I said, don't worry,
It's going to find you.
It'll come get you.
Keep living and it will find you.
Yeah.
I love what you write on page 38, and that is, the normal reaction to a season of suffering is to try to get out of it, to address the symptoms. Have a few drinks, play a few sad records, move on. The right thing to do when you're in moments of suffering is to stand erect in the suffering, you say. Wait, see what it has to teach you. Understand that your suffering is a task that, if handled correctly with the help of others, will lead to enlargement, not diminishment. The valley is where we shed the old self so the new self can emerge. There are no shortcuts.
Yeah. And this was not something I wanted to hear in 2013. And I just wanted to, cure the problem and distract myself the best I could. But it turns out I couldn't. And the problem was a void in my social life, but also reflecting a void in myself. And so I just hadn't done the inner work.
So let's talk about what you mean by suffering, because, I mean, there's all kinds of suffering. Yeah. So what do you mean when you say suffering?
Yeah, I would say any period where you've lost the thread of your life. I feel that happiness often is when you have just a nest of warm relationships. You have this family here, this thing you do here, you got all this warmth in your life, and you can travel between them. But I didn't have that.
Yeah.
And I had my kids, so that was a source of great warmth and support and love. But, they were off going to college and doing their thing. And so I just felt, what am I here for? That's
the most important question we all get to ask ourselves. And the bottom line is, though, without community and relationships, eventually people suffer.
Yeah.
Right.
And they have no resources when the setbacks come. If you don't know your why, then when the setbacks come, they're tough. I had to go alone into the wilderness, sort of a social wilderness, where there was nobody to perform for. And when there's nobody to perform for, your ego sort of crumbles because there's nothing for it to do that really matters.
And what you say in Second Mountain is that anybody who's hit a valley in their life, and if you live long enough, you will. Yeah. You will lose someone, or lose your job, or lose what you thought was your identity, or come across something that causes you to stumble and put you in the valley of your own soul. And that every valley leads to a wilderness, and that in order to get through the wilderness, you have to do that alone.
Right. Yeah. And I think what you discover...
And I think that is what is so frightening to people. They don't want to be alone.
Tell me about it.
Especially if you've lived your whole life trying to not be alone and to get away from just being with yourself.
Yeah, that's where the scary dark monsters are, down there. But I think what you find, and this is why life is good, you find, if you go down, there's a phrase I borrow from Annie Dillard, you find your complex and illimitable ability to care for others. You found at the heart and soul level that you really have this capacity to be caring toward others if you would only give yourself permission to be open.
That is what you mean by give yourself away.
You're at the beginning of that process.
Yes.
And I have a friend named Catherine Cox, who she said, when my first daughter was born, I realized I loved her more than evolution required.
Oh, I love that. I use that.
I've always loved that.
Yes.
Because it suggests that we have the things we do for our genes and all that, but there's an extra layer to being human. And that is, when you touch that layer, then you really have you go into yourself, and then it's a highway right out, and you begin to care. And then eventually people lift you out of the valley.
Coming up,
You say on page 239 of The Second Mountain that the name of my condition was pride. I was proud of who I'd become. I'd earned a certain identity and conception of myself by working hard and being pretty good at what I did. I found it easier to work all the time than to face the emptiness that was at the heart of my loneliness. Pride in self comes in many forms. Among them is the pride of power, the illusion that you can gain enough worldly power to make yourself secure. Yeah. This is the pride suffered by those who seek to control others or to dominate other nations. In the regular world, pride is often rewarded, but in the underplay of which I was becoming slowly aware, pride is the great tormentor and humility the great comfort.
Yeah.
Some nice writing there, David.
Thank you.
Yeah, some nice writing there.
I work on these things.
Yeah.
But pride is self-sufficiency, the thing, I can be self-sufficient. And that's the way to make yourself invulnerable. But eventually you get to the top of your first mountain, your career's gone okay.
Yeah,
really, is this
but
all there is?
How do you convince people to begin living a second mountain existence? First of all, I want you to explain first mountain versus second mountain. Go ahead.
So the first mountain is what a lot of us do. We get out of school, and we think, I'm going to climb this mountain. I'm going to be a cop, a teacher, a journalist, an actor, and that's the mountain I'm going to climb. And you get to the top of it, and it's unsatisfying, or you fail, you fall off, or something happens that wasn't part of the original plan. So you get to the top of it, and maybe you get a cancer scare, maybe you lose a child, something happens that just carves you open. And then you go through this valley experience we've talked about, and then you realize my ultimate allegiance is not going to be to myself. I'm going to fall in love with things, and I'm going to serve those things. And I say it's about making commitments.
Making that kind of a commitment to something or someone.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. There are four different categories of commitments, and most of us make to more than one, but sometimes only one: to a family and spouse, to a vocation, to a philosophy and faith, and to a community. And so some people just plant themselves down in their community, and they say, I love my town, and I'm going to serve my town. Second mountain is the service to one of those four things. It's the ultimate allegiance, not to self. And so, for example, I'm wearing this pin, which stands for the weavers, and people who are weaving our society together. And these are people who are on their second mountain. So, for example, there's a woman in Chicago named Aisha Butler. She was living in Englewood, which is a tough neighborhood there. Yep. And she was going to move out because it was dangerous. As she's moving out, she looks across out of her window and sees some little girls playing with broken bottles in an empty lot. And she turns to her husband and she says, we're not leaving. We're not going to be just another family who left that. And so she Googled, got volunteer in Englewood. And now she runs RAGE, which is a big community organization there. And so she planted herself down in Englewood, and she serves her neighbors in her community. And so that's, to me, what the second mountain life looks like.
Well, I read all those stories about people who are doing extraordinary things with sometimes very little resources, people who are giving themselves away. And what I was thinking about is everyone who reads your book is not going to be able to start their own organization. Right. They're not going to be able to go build a school or save kids in a poor area. And I'm thinking about just the average person who's doing the best they can, but feels that void that you so beautifully articulate throughout the book.
Yeah, a lot of the people I describe in the book have a very high standard. And so any of us, we don't have time to lead these really self-sacrificial lives, but we could invite our neighbors over for dinner.
Right.
When somebody comes out, moves in the neighborhood, we could have a barbecue for them. They're just little things that we could do, and if we all did a few little things, contribute.
And I was thinking, I think there's no higher calling than being a parent, than being a good one.
Right.
And you can be a first mountain parent, or you can be a second mountain parent, if you just shift the paradigm to...
Right. To serving your kid and not making your kid the reflection of your own parenting skills. And I find, I teach college, and I find there's a significant number of my kids who are the victim of conditional love, that their parents love them, but they are anxious about them. And when the kid does something that the parent thinks will lead to success, the beam of love is strong. when the kid does something the parent thinks won't lead to success, the beam of love is withdrawn.
Yeah.
And so the most important relationship in their lives is at peril, and they're scared, and they try not to they avoid risk. And it's just a punishing experience to be the subject of conditional love, where you have to earn your parents' love. And frankly, there's too much conditional love in our society, the idea that we have to earn love. We humans love each other because of who we are.
First of all, I came to know about this book. I read that article in the New York Times, an excerpt, The Quest for a Moral Life. And I thought, whoa, you're really calling it out. You used the word disconnection, and that resonated with me because I believe real connection is, what I've been seeking all my life through the shows and the work. And I agree with you that we can all feel this disconnection. There's this, something has happened to us.
Yeah.
But I want to focus on that one sentence that you included in the article: hatred, fragmentation, and disconnection in our society. In your opinion, what is the root? How did we get here?
Well, what happened to me has happened to millions of people around the country. I'm not unusual. I got disconnected, and around the country, millions of people are disconnected. If you ask people how many times do you have a meaningful conversation with your neighbors, only 8% say they have meaningful conversations with their neighbors. 35% of people over 45 say they're chronically lonely. Majority of people say no one really knows them well. The suicide rate is up 30% since 1999. The teenage
Isn't that incredible?
Even more incredible is that this teenage suicide rate is up 70%, 70%. And so all of this, opiate addiction, these deaths of despair are products of a world that's become detached from each other, and there are people alone, people not being helped, people do distrust each other. If you asked people a generation ago, do you trust your neighbors? A generation ago, 60% said yes.
Yeah.
Now it's 33% and 19% of millennials. The younger you get, the more distrust there is. So imagine going through life thinking, I can only really rely on myself.
So do you think we lost a core? Where did we lose that?
Yeah, I tell a cultural story. I think culture and our values really shape us. So in the 1950s, we had a very communal culture. It was like, we're all in this together. We got to get through the war, depression, we're all in this together. And that had some really good features.
That was our mantra, basically, and, our collective mantra.
But that culture had real problems. It was too stifling.
Right.
It tolerated a lot of racism, sexism, anti-Semitism. We had to chop that up and move to something else. And we chopped it up in the 60s.
Right.
And we became more individualistic. I'm free to be myself. I just want to be free to be myself. And we needed to do that.
That was a good thing for then.
Right. But we've now had 60 years of that. And we've sort of run out the string. So we've got a lot of individualism. I'm free to be myself. But we don't have an ethos that encourages connection. You got to commit to connection. I really will be there for others. But then it's a skill.
You write about this incredible spiritual experience that you had. Where did that come in the process of writing?
Yeah, it's sort of been a lifelong, very gradual. Like some people have mystic, like a road to Damascus lightning. God says, here I am. So obey me, and I didn't have anything.
You had that.
But I had a gradual, as a friend of mine put it, reality was more enchanted than the categories I had for it. And so, for example, we talked about souls. I was in Penn Station, which is in New York City, which is just about the ugliest place on the face of the earth, and the least likely you're to have a spiritual experience. But suddenly I'm in these tunnels, we're all walking out of the subway, and I think all these people have souls, and they all have souls that are breathing in them and enchanted in them, and some souls are suffering in them. And so we don't even think about the depths of the reality we inhabit every day, but life is more enchanted and magical than we assume it is. And when I'm doing my journalism and writing about others, or you're talking to others, it wouldn't be right to think, oh, I'm just talking to a bag of genetic material. There's some meaning. The person's life has infinite meaning. And so when you think we have a soul, and I know you've talked about this, then it's a short leap to think we all have a shared soul, and that there's a creator. We live in a created universe. And then that doesn't answer a lot of the questions you have, but it's a beginning.
It's a beginning.
Coming up.
As I was reading this, I said to one of the producers, when I finished, I said, it's kind of like David Brooks is now the Noah of our time, trying to tell us the flood is coming, the flood is coming.
Well, the water's up to here. So.
Yeah, water's up to here, and no one's listening because they're trying to work the filters on their Instagram.
Yeah, I hope people are noticing. And so one of the things that we're lacking is to fight segregation, we had a civil rights movement. To fight environmental degradation, we had an environmental movement. We now have a connection problem, but we don't really have a national community movement. And so the people out there are a movement that doesn't know it's a movement yet. They haven't built the institutions, the common sense of ethos, the idea that we can all do this better if we do it together. Yeah. And that's really what we're trying to do.
You devote a whole chapter to our Instagram life.
Yeah.
How do we do that? How do you convince the Instagram lifers that moving towards community is the answer?
Yeah, well, I think eventually it burns itself out. Like Instagram life is where you judge your life by aesthetic criteria. Am I having fun right now? Am I having fun right now? Can I put this on Instagram? Does this look good right now? And after a while, it doesn't really add up to much. And so it's good. I'm all for, getting together for brunch and taking selfies with your Bloody Marys. But most people suffer a concept that was very prominent in the Middle Ages, and we don't talk about it much, but I think it's all around.
Acedia?
Acedia. And that's the loss of desire. Like, your heart is not really engaged in your own life. Your heart is over here, but your life is sort of over there. And a lot of people are doing the run of brunch and getting drinks and going here and doing Pilates there and Bikram yoga there, but they haven't found a thing to devote themselves to.
Pictures all look good.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the posts look good.
I had a psychologist tell me the other day that I was asking about why is suicide rate so up and depression in the young. She said a lot of my patients have a lot of different performative selves they send out into the social media world, but none of them are their real selves. And so there's like a crisis there. They have these personas they've created, one for Instagram, one for Snapchat, one for Twitter or whatever. But it's not the real self. And I really want to understand the core of this teenage depression and suicide, mental health facilities and colleges overwhelmed. Something's going on. I confess I really
Something
don't
major is happening. I can see it's destroying us. Right. It's destroying us. So how do you suggest people begin plugging back into their own lives? How do we get to the second mountain?
Yeah, well, first, I believe in books. I'm a bookish person, so I always have a spiritual book going. And that just keeps reminding me. And then you look for a social problem that captures you. And sometimes you are
You're looking for a spiritual book, this might be the one. Second mountain.
Just to mention.
Just to mention, yes.
And then you're looking for a problem. What problem grabs me? And I was lifted in my life by a couple named Kathy and David, who had a home in D.C., and they had a kid in D.C. public schools, and that kid had a friend who didn't have a place to stay, so they invited that kid over. And then another kid came. And by the time I went to dinner there 6 years ago for the first time on a Thursday night, there were 30 kids around the dinner table, dozens
Yeah, I love that
sleeping
story,
around.
yes.
I walk in there the first day, introduce myself to a kid, and I say, I'm David. And he says, we don't really shake hands here. We hug here. Yes. And so we all need places like that. That gives you a glimpse of a better way to live.
You would like to see people and even entire societies move towards what you call in Second Mountain, moral renewal, moving from lives based on bad values to a life based on better ones. How do we do that when we see every day that greed and ambition are really running amok in the world?
Committing ourselves first to relationships, and that sounds easy. But we sometimes think life is quantitative, how much, but it's qualitative, how thick. And so some organizations, the people have come in there and they're leaders of organizations, and they make sure we have a moral mission for our organization. Everybody in this organization is going to know what it is. I'm going to really serve as a mentor, serving you, as the famous servant leadership. And it's how you do things every day. And the one story I tell in the book I got from a book called Practical Wisdom. It's about a hospital janitor named Luke.
Oh, yes.
And Luke...
That was an incredible story. I'm glad you're sharing that. Go ahead.
So Luke was just cleaning rooms, and one of the rooms he was cleaning was a kid was in a coma that he wasn't coming out of. And his dad would sit there every day. And one day Luke cleaned the room and his dad was out getting a smoke. And so he cleans the room, but then later the dad comes up to him and says, you didn't clean my son's room. And the first mountain response is to think, my job here is cleaning rooms. And if that's your mentality, then you say to the dad, I did clean your room, but you were out getting a smoke. The second mountain mentality is to say, my job is not cleaning rooms. My job is providing comfort to patients and their families. And if that's your mentality, then you go back and clean it again the second time so he can have the comfort of seeing you clean it. And that's what Luke does. And so we're all in a lot of daily.
I know. I read that story, David, and I thought, I'm sorry. I would have been first mountain. I would have been. I cleaned the room. I cleaned it. See, I cleaned it.
You of all people would not.
I cleaned the room. But I have had a similar story. Years ago, I was in Baltimore and working for WJZ-TV, which was at the top of the hill, and they call it Television Hill. And one of the janitors who, Joe, was walking up the hill, and I stopped to give Joe a ride, and I was asking Joe, how do you like working here, and how is it for you? And he said, I just love working in TV.
Yeah,
Says the guy who is, I just love working in TV every day. I wouldn't trade it for anything.
Yeah.
Says Joe the janitor.
Yeah, that's an important part of a healthy organization. Everybody in the organization knows how they're connected to the mission.
Yeah.
Coming up.
I found this so interesting, your quote from Nietzsche, who wrote about how people can identify their calling in life. He wrote, the way to discover what you were put on earth for is to go back into your past, list the times you felt most fulfilled, and then see if you can draw a line through them. What have you truly loved thus far? What has ever uplifted your soul? What has dominated and delighted at the same time? Assemble these revered objects in a row before you, and perhaps they will reveal a law by their nature and their order, the fundamental law of your very self.
Yeah.
I've always said, if you look back at your life and connect the dots, there's a pattern of the things that made you feel fulfilled.
Yeah, I love
that.
that.
This is the same thing he's saying, right?
I love that line, the law of your very self.
So when you did this exercise.
Yes.
What did you find out about yourself?
I find how aesthetic it is that, like, I read a book when I was 7 called Paddington the Bear. And at that moment, I wanted to become a writer. And it was just because I loved the feel of it. I have a quote in there from Annie Dillard, who was interviewing a painter. She said, why did you go into painting? And the woman just said, I love the smell of paint.
Yeah.
Some people, you just find that thing where you feel at home and trust the aesthetic sensibility of it.
Well, one of my favorite lines, you write so beautifully all the time. On page 115, you write, we bury the faint crackling of our inner fire underneath other safer noises. I'm going to say that again because it's so beautifully written. We bury the faint crackling of our inner fire underneath other safer noises and settle for a false life.
Yeah.
So how do we teach children and young people not to bury the fire?
Yeah. Well, one thing is we can do, put some rules around the phones.
Yeah.
I think about how we communicate. We're talking about the heart and soul. How much heart and soul communication happens through a screen, through the phone when we're texting? I have a friend, he has a rule for himself. Every morning before he looks at a screen, he goes outside and looks at the sky for a few minutes. Just to, I'm going to look up. And then he has a rule where he's going to take 1 hour a day, 1 day a week, I think week a year, no screens, just Sabbath. He's going to create Sabbaths. So that's one of the things I think we can do.
I read your column, and I'm always looking for your column. Are you always thinking about all the time our culture and what our actions in the culture and experiences are really conveying about us? Is that how your mind works?
I think some people think about technology shapes history or politics. I think culture, and we shape history from the ground up. And so that's why I'm optimistic, by the way.
Are you?
Yeah, I am very, because we've never underestimate human ingenuity. When we went from the 50s to the 60s, we just shifted our culture, and we had a collective problem.
Yes, and a lot of that ingenuity comes on the first mountain, I must say, David.
No, well, I'm not against the first mountain. I just want us to have both.
Okay.
So, but you got to have the skills that you build on the first mountain. You got to have the platforms,
right?
Frankly, you know, we solve our problems. We shift over. Cultures work for a little while. They stop working. We chop it up, and those moments when we chop it up are bumpy. We're in one of those moments now. 1968 was such a moment. And you can get hopeless because everything seems to be flying to pieces. But then we pivot, we figure it out. And the way I think culture changes is a small group of people find a better way to live. If we all followed them, we'd create change.
And I think it's also a good reminder of what you just said. And those of us who are old enough to have lived through 1968, we thought it for, it was a bad time. Martin Luther King was killed in April, and then Robert Kennedy in the fall, and riots and dissension and fragmentation, all of that was happening then.
Right.
But it seems to be more condoned now. I mean, I thought even in '68, there was a moral center, there was a moral core about this is right and this is wrong. I think that that's gotten meshed and confused.
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed, like I grew up in Greenwich Village in that period, so I was sort of surrounded by hippies. There was actually a joyfulness to them that sometimes I don't find in our movements. And joy is another big word, I think, for both of us.
I was just going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
You say on page 201, ultimately joy is found not in satisfying your desires, but in changing your desires so you have the best desires. And I thought, well, aren't best desires personal? Isn't that, subjective? So what are the best desires?
Yeah.
Are we talking about your best desires or the reader's best desires?
Yeah, we all love a lot of things. I bet we all have pretty similar view of what's a higher desire. So for example, if you lie for money, you've put your love of money above your love of honesty. And we all have an instinct, honesty is a better desire. So raising your desire up to the things that really are worth desiring.
Yeah.
But I make this distinction between happiness and joy. Mm-hmm. And happiness is when the self expands, you move toward your goals, you achieve a success. And joy is when you transcend the self, where a mother and daughter are just so in love with each other that you can't tell where one ends and one begins. When somebody's out in nature, when somebody's so lost in their work, they've lost all consciousness. And my rule is happiness is great. I'm all for happiness, success, and winning the Super Bowl. Joy is better. If you aim your life toward joy, you'll end up in the right spot.
How do you go from being an atheist to coming to, which I thought this was a beautiful term too, coming to the understanding that God is the ground of our being?
Yeah. So, well, the simplest answer was that
read the book.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Simplest answer is read the book, but okay.
Life is also, the categories I had didn't explain life as I experienced it. I think we at key moments in our lives, get a sense of transcendence, get a sense there's something magical and enchanted about the world. And for me, faith isn't like God telling me every day what to do. I don't hear his voice that often, but I feel we live in a created world. And that there is some sense of purpose and meaning to our life. And human beings are amazing creatures. Our capacity to love for each other is, as my friend said, more than evolution required. It's like, it's really...
I just love that. I loved more than evolution required.
Yeah.
Yes.
Coming up,
on page 42, you write, this is the pivotal point, maybe, of this whole book. On the surface of our lives, most of us build the hard shell. It is built to cover fear and insecurity and win approval and success. When you get down to the core of yourself, you find a different, more primeval country. And in it, a deep yearning to care and connect. You could call this deep core of yourself the pleroma, is it called? Or the pleroma?
Yeah, pleroma, I guess.
Or substrate. It is where your heart and soul reside. So many people are disconnected from that. How do we begin that reconnection?
Well, I think you get out of your ego.
Mm-hmm.
The ego is like, how am I doing? What do people think of me?
Yeah.
And believe me, I'm certainly have not left that behind.
Yeah.
But you sort of focus, well, what does my heart want? My heart wants to fuse with another. How am I doing in that department? Mm-hmm. And what does the soul want? My soul wants to serve some good. How am I doing in that department? So just paying more attention about down here. And it seems simple, but it's hard. Like
you say in the book that the goal is to fall through your ego.
Yeah. And
how do you do that?
Well, I think it's this process of going to the valley, get broken open, let somebody reach you up, and then once you're ready for the second climb, you just find things to commit to. Once a month, I find somebody just radiates joy.
Yeah.
The famous person I was with recently for this Weave project, I was around Yo-Yo Ma, the cellist.
Oh, yeah.
That guy just radiates joy. Because he cares about people.
You know who else does that? My friend Gail.
She does, yeah.
My friend Gail, she is just luminous.
Yeah.
That's why she's had this major moment in her career.
Right.
At 64, it's like her
drawn to
career is broken because she just radiates joy. And from the moment she took the job sitting on CBS, I mean, I said you were sitting in the seat of your soul and your life right now. You write about your second wife, Anne, who you married in 2018.
Right.
So she's still like your new bride.
She is. I'm blissfully happy.
And you're 23 years in distance in age. You must have known that not everybody was going to understand your relationship, and many of your weekly readers took to social media. Somebody said, I'm having trouble squaring Mr. Morrill's articles with his personal life. Until he's willing to discuss his own behavior, he cannot speak for hours. So how do you handle that kind of criticism?
Yeah, well, of course, people gossip and they don't know what actually happened. And I describe a little what happened. And for her, we just exchanged memos about my last book. And then my marriage was ending, and then she was just exchanging memos. I was living alone in the apartment. I was going through a bad period. She really had no view into my other life.
Where you'd been, yeah.
We were working as research and author. And then what happened in sort of toward the end of 2013, I was in a vulnerable place in life, and she was an amazing person. And I started developing feelings for her. And maybe she started developing feelings for me. And we knew there was this huge age gap. We knew the situation we were in. So what did she do? She cut off communications between us, because she said this can't happen, and she moved away to Houston. And so she went away for 3 years, and we were out of communication for all that time. 3 years later, still she's sort of on my mind, and then it happened.
Yeah.
And then what had seemed impossible began to seem inevitable, and my love for her is as strong as can be, and I think her love for me is very strong.
Has this new marriage, has this relationship brought you joy?
Yes.
Yeah. I appreciate what you write about the social fabric. As you bring the book to an end, you talk about, whenever I treat another person as if he were an object, I rip the social fabric. When I treat another person as an infinite soul, I woven the social fabric. Whenever I lie, abuse, stereotype, or traumatize a person, I've ripped the fabric. Whenever I see someone truly and make them feel known, I have woven the fabric. Whenever I accuse someone of corruption without evidence, I have ripped the social fabric. Whenever I disagree without maligning motives, I have woven it. The social fabric is created through an infinity of small moral acts, and it can be destroyed by a series of immoral ones. And I think that's what so many of us are feeling, is that like the social fabric is being ripped from us daily, particularly if you watch the news, if you take in all the...
None of us are perfect. We all, stereotype. We all do things that aren't fair or right to other people. We don't always take the time to really deeply understand others. But it is, the good news, it's up to us, that it's our choices that create the social fabric. It's people up above in politics do shape that. The president can really rip a social fabric.
Do you think that's what's happening now? Is the president ripping our social fabric?
For sure, every day. Every day he has an instinct for where our wounds are, and he pokes at them and he rips us. And so that's hard. But I still think he's not as powerful as we are.
As we, the collective, are. And so I've heard one of the candidates talking about this recently, about even before policy, we need to mend, I don't think he used the term fabric, but we need to mend the moral core. Do you think that's what needs to happen?
We need institutional change too, but institutional change can't happen until we have trusting bonds between us and we can work together for it.
Yeah.
And so if we're distrusting each other, then we can't do the institutional change we need.
We need a second mountain leader.
Coming up,
we started this conversation with the quote from Rabbi Goldstein, we have lost our soul. Do you think we've lost our soul? Or are we in the midst of gaining our soul?
Yeah, well, you have to go through the valley. And what the rabbi said was, he pointed out a truth, and I think we all understand that truth. And when we all understand the truth, we can change our behavior to reflect the truth. And so I think we've had a rough few years, and a lot of people are lying dead from mass shootings and other things. But people feel and adjust, and we have a lot of things around us to help us.
Yes, and how many will have to be killed before we do something?
Right, I know, but I don't know,
Yeah.
That's the weird question of every era.
Yes. What is the question or the mystery that sits in your mind that you hope to have answered in your lifetime? Do you still have one?
I'd love to know God, really. I mean, God is weird. I mean, the scientists say we live in a multi-universe, like there are millions of universes.
Yeah.
And they're all parallel with each other, and there's another one where you and I are also sitting in that other one.
Yeah.
That's a weird idea, but God is weirder than that. Like the idea that something existed before time and breathed life into the world and embodies a moral law, that's weird. And so I would love to just get some deeper understanding, some deeper contact with that. And I think it would be, I see people who've got what they call the full disease, and those people radiate joy, the one who really have some, where God is just integrated into them.
Can you describe a moment when you experienced true grace?
Yeah, I knew grace before I knew God, weirdly. Which is say, I felt smiled upon before I believed there was any deity. And one story I tell is, I was coming home from a TV show I do called The News Hour on PBS, and I pulled into my driveway, and the driveway wrapped around the side of the house. And the kids were like 12, 9, and 4.
Oh, yeah.
And they were chasing each other across the yard, running after this ball. And they were tumbling after each other, and they were laughing and giggling. And for some reason, my lawn looked great. I don't know how that happened. And I sat in the car with the windshield. I just saw this picture of family happiness. And as I say, it was one of those moments where the reality spilled outside its boundaries. I just felt gratitude for happiness that I couldn't possibly deserve or live up to. And that's what grace is. I mean, it's like, wow.
There was a moment of grace.
Yeah, for sure.
I was in that car with you when you were watching, the way you described it in the book.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much.
My pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for the second mountain.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for everything you've done to actually be the foundation for it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.